I'm very grateful to the law school, and especially Professor Koob for having me, and also need to express many years of indebtedness to IHS, which has supported my work on free speech. Since the 1990s, I come at it from a particular place, which is as someone who spent 20 years of my life working on the issue of same-sex marriage, and more years than that as an activist and writer and thinker on these issues. But I want to start today in the past, not that long ago. Some of you may have seen this scene online. I see some heads or not. You all recognize this? This is a confrontation at Yale University in 2015 that happened in the courtyard of a residential college called Silliman College. A faculty member who specializes in human development named Erica Christakis sent around an email before Halloween that year saying that she believed that if students had problems with other students' Halloween costumes, they should take it up directly with those students. This created a firestorm on campus of groups protesting that this was unfair, leading to a confrontation between students and Erica Christakis' husband, a well-known psychologist called Nicholas Christakis, in the courtyard of this college. So let's just listen.
I don't agree with that.
Then why the fuck did you accept the position?
Because I have
Who the fuck hired you?
I have a different vision than you.
Step down! If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down! It is not about creating an intellectual space! It is not! Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here!
It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. It is about creating a home here. Now, set aside the colorful and inappropriate language that the student was using. He was making a point, which is that we are minority students here at Yale. We need to feel safe and comfortable. It is our home. We are not here in order to sacrifice our safety on the altar of some kind of intellectual ritual. It is not about creating an intellectual space. This is a proposition that's meaningful, even if we don't like how it was stated. And it's had many ramifications. You've seen many of them. I won't go through them. Just recently, you may have heard, this is Professor Dorian Abbott, University of Chicago. He's a geophysicist that studies exoplanetary geophysics. His lecture at MIT on the science, not on politics, was canceled because he wrote an article for Newsweek criticizing affirmative action in college admission. Now, that article, of course, had nothing to do with the scientific lecture that he was given. This looks to a lot of us like the out-and-out suppression of scholarship because of speech that was deemed offensive or unsafe. We see a lot of this, and we see a lot of defenses of it. Here are just three of them. I pulled all of these from recent student manifestos. Free speech has given those who seek to perpetuate systems of domination a platform to project their bigotry. With undue burden on specific groups of students, asking them to continually defend their right to exist in an academic community for supposed intellectual enrichment of that same community. Ideology of free speech, absolutism that prioritizes ideas over people, giving, quote, deeply offensive language a platform at this institution will inevitably imperil marginalized students. The fundamental idea of all of these is basically the same, which is that free speech imperils minorities. I want to suggest a different point of view, one that was articulated beautifully, for example, by the person that I would say is the second greatest American of the 19th century. This is Frederick Douglass. You've all heard of him. In 1860, excuse the pointer, I don't really know how to stop that. In 1860, he and other abolitionists were scheduled to talk in Boston at a meeting. The meeting was interrupted and shut down by a mob silencers. This was not the first time. In fact, the South relied heavily on a regime of censorship and brutality in the South and projected that in the North wherever it could find supporters, and even attempted to pass federal legislation forbidding the criticism of slavery. 2 days later, in one of his most famous speeches, you can see Douglass said, "Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its existence would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South." And he adds, the point people forget, equally clear is the right to hear. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker, a point which is too often forgotten. Douglass was not alone, minority activists who took this point of view. This is the late John Lewis, one of the great Americans of the 20th century, and a man who understood what violence and danger to minorities meant. He had his head bashed in, was beaten within an eyelash of his life in the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings, he famously said. Here's my favorite. This is a clip from a documentary called Mighty Ira about a former ACLU official named Ira Glasser. This is an undated clip from the Phil Donahue show in the 1970s, and I'll let Glasser tell the story.
I was on a Donahue show once with Hosea Williams.
Ira Glasser, who
we were discussing the rights of the Klan. He was on that show ostensibly to debate me about it, and he surprised everybody.
Head of the United States Civil Rights Commission.
Well, Phil, one thing we must understand, a right is not a right in America until it's extended to every American. And even though they beat and brutalize us in seeking that right, if they take the Ku Klux Klan off the cable today,
the NAACP is next.
They're going to take the NAACP off tomorrow. I was Dr. King's field journal. I organized every major march. The problem with the black struggle in America has been black leaders like King didn't have the ability to communicate with the masses. Once that ability to communicate with the masses, things changed.
Now, pretty remarkable in today's context, Hosea Williams is saying, let the Ku Klux Klan speak. For that matter, let them speak on TV. I assume that's what he means by on the cable. We've come a long way from there. The event at Tulane University was canceled. You can see the headline by the author of an acclaimed anti-racism book. After students said the event was quote-unquote violent, what was the book? It was a history of the Ku Klux Klan and the author's own deep history with it. Obviously, he's not a Klan supporter. What would Hosea Williams have said about an environment where you can't talk about the horrible depredations of the Ku Klux Klan on a college campus? And it's not only the Klan. This is one of a lot of recent student polls. They all come out about the same. This is a very well substantiated polling result. About 60% of American students feel chilled. That is to say, they felt they could not express their opinion on the subject because of how students, the professor, or the administration would respond. And even more of them say that other students feel that way. 68% say that the climate on campus prevents other students from speaking freely. Now, also about 60% of the American public is saying they feel chilled to talk about their political views. But of course, the campus environment is an environment where we would expect to have a freer condition, because we come here in order to debate and talk about ideas. So this is a pretty worrisome development. And these are the sorts of things that students and faculty say. These are quotations from my own interviews. They can be replicated by me and others ad nauseam. Student says, I often felt like the only dissenting opinion on today's college campuses. The risk of engaging in debate of controversial topics vastly outweigh the benefits. Whereas another student, a Princeton graduate, told me when I asked why he doesn't talk at all ever about, say, race, class, gender. On campus, he said, because it's all downside. Certain points of view about touchy subjects never reach the surface. The result is an echo chamber. Professor, I feel I am constantly tiptoeing through a minefield. I feel there is absolutely nothing I can do as a professor to stop this. It's like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. These are not good things to be hearing on college campuses. You can hear them across the country. And more often than not, you hear them justified as measures that are necessary for the protection of minorities. So that's what I want to spend the remainder of my time with you talking about. Mostly some history, but a little bit of theory, just a bit. It's a law school after all. Modern free speech theory dates back a long time. But in its modern form, probably John Stuart Mill, 1859, on Liberty. Raise your hand if you've read it or part of it. Most of you, not everyone, those who haven't should. It's a very short book, a masterpiece and a touchstone. And then the concept about 103 years ago of the marketplace of ideas comes into being in a Supreme Court dissent by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. There are 4 primary reasons that I, at least, and a lot of other people, favor free speech. The first is the argument from knowledge. Where knowledge comes from is pitting ideas against ideas, prejudice against prejudice, bias against bias. We all might be wrong. We never know when we're wrong, unless we're subject to vigorous dissent from others. We all nonetheless think that we are right. Knowledge does not occur. Learning does not occur in an environment where everyone shares the same point of view. So efforts to snuff out ideas that someone deems hateful, offensive, unsafe leads to the diminution of knowledge. And not just incidentally, but inherently. This is the core of Mill's argument. He points out that even if someone is 95% wrong, that 5% can be the precious correction we need. And in fact, even if someone is 100% wrong, it is still worth engaging in them because they're going to prevent our ideas from becoming what he called dead dogmas. And this is actually true. Holocaust deniers should be allowed to speak. And because of their challenges to the notion that the Nazis physically could have used enough gas to kill 6 million Jews, we learn how the Nazis did that. The second big argument is the argument from fundamental freedom. And that's that repressing the right to dissent, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience is a fundamental violation of human rights. We cannot flourish as human beings. We cannot learn. We cannot function if we live in fear that at any moment we could be arrested, harassed, ostracized, or brutalized because of our beliefs. Then we cross into the boundary of something more like a totalitarian society. Third is the argument from efficacy. Censorship usually backfires. More often than not, especially in today's environment, it actually draws attention to the ideas that you try to suppress. People get very interested in knowing what it is that they're not supposed to read. A lot of people don't realize this. The Weimar Republic, the 1920s, early 30s in Germany had hate speech laws. Hitler and the Nazis adeptly used those laws by violating them and getting themselves put on trial for hate speech and plastered the country with posters that said things like, what is it that the authorities don't want Herr Hitler to be able to say? And of course, trolls do the exact same thing today. They love it when they're protested, canceled, harassed, bullied. That makes them famous. The fourth, I think, to me, the most fundamental of all of these 4, so they're all important, is the argument from power. Who do you trust to do the censoring? Most people who favor speech codes, hate speech laws, that kind of thing, imagine themselves in charge, making the decisions. And I always ask them, well, if you had federal hate speech laws, How will you feel when Donald J. Trump is in charge of administering those laws on January 20th, 2025? And the answer is probably not very good. We have thousands of years, literally, of experience with these regimes that tell us that in majoritarian societies, majorities decide what minorities can say, and in authoritarian society, authorities decide what minorities can say, and in neither case is that good for minorities. And dissidents, of course, are the ultimate minority and the most endangered minority in any given situation. You know, as a gay person, this is a famous episode, but not the only one. Canada in the 1990s passed a well-intended feminist statute against pornography, because pornography was harmful and hateful. What was the first thing that the authorities in Toronto did? They raided Glad Day Bookshop, a lesbian bookshop. These are the people that you guys want to put in charge? Probably not a good idea. I don't mean you in this case. But I want to get off theory for a bit. I want to talk about some things that have happened during and just before my lifetime. Because I think they really tell the story better than any theory actually can. And I want to begin in 1954. This is a cover article of One magazine. One was the first openly gay journal in America. It was non-pornographic, published, essays, poetry, that sort of thing. Almost immediately, one of its early issues was banned by the postmaster. America in those years had a speech code. It was called obscenity law. And the only way you could distribute at that time was through the US mail. So being told you couldn't distribute through the mail meant you were effectively shut down. After that first ban was lifted, One published this article, You Can't Say That, a critique of the postmaster's censorship policy. You all will be amazed to learn that the Postmaster General then banned this issue of the magazine criticizing the Postmaster General. He claimed the ban was based on an essay about Sappho. Do you believe that? One magazine decided to fight this and raised a constitutional claim about it. This is what the lower courts said in the 1950s. U.S. District Court said the suggestion advanced that homosexuals should be recognized as a segment of our people and be accorded special privilege as a class is rejected. Now, notice the maneuver that this judge is making. For homosexuals, free speech is a special privilege, a special right. The Court of Appeals, I think, put its cards on the table more squarely, saying cheap pornography is how it characterized the magazine, dirty, vulgar, and offensive to the moral senses, obscene and filthy, lewd and lascivious. Social standards are fixed by and for the great majority and not by or for a hardened or weakened minority. Remember that word, weakened, by the way. We're going to be coming back to that. Things did not look very promising for One magazine in the lower courts. Nonetheless, they went on to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court surprised everyone. Now, I am a slow reader, but I am a very fast talker. I hereby announce I'm about to do something that has never before been ventured in the Scalia School of Law. I am going to read an entire Supreme Court opinion in under 10 seconds. Here it is. The petition for writ of certiorari is granted and the judgment of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is reversed. The case of One Incorporated versus Olison. Olison was the Postmaster General of Los Angeles. The per curiam opinion, 9-0, that's the entire opinion. I think they should do more of that. And that's the moment that opened the door for homosexuals to speak in America. I just want to point something out in passing, because this is so moving. You'll hear me choke up a bit during this talk. I always do, because some of these are people I knew. This is my life. Eric Joelberg. He's the pro bono lawyer who spent 4 or 5 years on this seemingly hopeless case for one magazine. And we're not talking ancient history. At last check, he was still alive. He might not be alive anymore, but I couldn't find an obituary. This is a picture of him in 2015. A friend of mine went out and talked to him. He said it was all in the line of duty. Amazing. Now I want to show you another hero of gay civil rights, one that some of you may have heard of. Anyone recognize this person? I know a few of you do. Raise your hand if the name Frank Kameny rings a bell. About 3 or 4 people. Well, good for you. Usually the number is 0, maybe sometimes 1. Kameny, a man I knew personally, was arguably the greatest gay civil rights leader of the last century. There are other names, of course, and other peoples. He was never alone. Remarkable man. Served in World War II in combat in European theater. Came back, got a PhD in astronomy, I think from Harvard. Was a brilliant scientific mind. Went to work for the U.S. Army Map Service. And then this happened. This is from a talk he gave only a few months before he died.
And as was mentioned, I had a position as an astronomer with what was then called the Army Map Service here in Washington. And one day I was called in by 2 Civil Service Commission investigators. They said, "We have information that leads us to believe that you're homosexual. Do you have any comment?" I said, "What's the information?" They said, "We can't tell you." I said, "Well, then I can't comment. And in any case, it's none of your business." I was fired. I proceeded to appeal all the way up to, I follow Rauch all the way. So I appealed through the Civil Service Commission and on up. They're just an executive branch agency all the way up to the White House without success, to the House and Senate, civil service committees without success, and eventually with the help of the ACLU went to court.
Frank didn't have much luck. His appeals to the Civil Service Commission went nowhere. The head of that commission, a man named John W. Macy Jr., remember that name, refused even to meet with him, saying it was an open and shut matter of federal policy. There was no point having a meeting with him. Now, what typically happened in those years was that if you were outed as a homosexual and fired, you became a pariah, you moved away, you were a figure of shame. Frequently, you never worked again. Frank Kameny never again held a steady job. That was common in those years. You became kind of, in many ways, a non-person, especially if you were a teacher, lawyer, something like that. Kameny was different. He decided to fight. When he failed with the U.S. Civil Service Commission, he tried Congress. He received correspondence like this. In reply, may I state unequivocally that in almost 6 years of service in the United States Congress, I have not received such a revolting communication. Plenty more like that in the archives. He tried the president, of course. So he tried the courts. He filed the very first gay rights claim ever before the United States Supreme Court. And because the ACLU decided at that point it was a lost cause, they left him on his own. He wrote his own brief. You can buy it on Amazon. I recommend you do so. It is a brilliant, brilliant argument. Here are a couple of things he said. In World War II, petitioner did not hesitate to fight the Germans with bullets in order to help preserve his rights, freedoms, and liberties, and those of others. In 1960, it is ironically necessary that he fight the Americans with words in order to preserve against a tyrannical government some of those same rights, freedoms, and liberties for himself and others. Notice, with words, those are his weapons. The Commission's regulation as it stands is unconstitutional in that by establishing tyranny over the mind of its citizen, it is inconsistent with and violates the provisions, stipulations, spirit, and intent of the First Amendment to the Federal Constitution. tyranny over the mind. What's he saying? That the government is not just executing a policy that has to do with jobs and workplace discrimination. What it's actually trying to do here is enforce an entire regime of mind control, of thought control. And he's right about that. That's what these limits were really all about. The Supreme Court did not grant cert. I never heard that case. Kameny wasn't done, though. He founded the Mattachine Society of Washington, still in existence, headquartered not far from here, one of the first and most important gay rights groups. And in 1965, he and some others organized the first gay rights protests. This is the one in front of the White House. Notice they're all in their Sunday best. This is 6 years before Gay Pride and its much more festive, transgressive environment. Look at the things the sign says. They're asking for their jobs, civil service commission policy. They want to work in the military. Sexual preference is irrelevant to federal employment. This kind of thing was completely outrageous in 1965. Nor does he stop there. In 1971, he becomes the first openly gay candidate to run for Congress when Congress creates a slot for a DC delegate. And actually, he, according to a surprise Washington Post, he ran a surprisingly effective campaign, though he lost. Possibly the most important thing he does is get us out of this book. You all recognize this. This is the 1968 edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I was born in 1960, and for the first 13 years of my life, I was mentally ill, and thus, of course, unemployable in many situations, potentially treatable. In some cases, homosexuals were lobotomized. In other cases, we were treated with shock therapy. Arguably, the one person most responsible for winning World War II, Alan Turing, later when it was discovered to be gay, he was forced to undergo a choice between prison and chemical castration. He chose the latter, and a year later committed suicide. This was a fantastic burden on homosexual persons, despite the fact that scientific evidence dating from the early 50s found that psychiatrists, if given blind samples of personality and mental illness tests of straight people and gay people, could not tell which was which. Kameny protests that. He uses words. Not far from here at the Shoreham Hotel, 1971, in an APA conference, he takes advantage of a disruption to mount the stage and accuse the assembled psychiatric great and good of committing a campaign of extermination against homosexuals. 1973, the American Psychiatric Association, by a vote of its general membership, revoked our status of mental illness. Kameny referred to it as the greatest mass cure in human history. 2009, this is the part where I always joke about. It's so meaningful to me. Kameny lived to see in 1975 the revocation of the ban on gay employment, federal government. He lived to see 1995 when President Clinton lifted the ban on security clearances for gay people. He saw the Supreme Court end sodomy laws in 2003. And here he is in 2009 being recognized by President Obama as Obama signs the first mild protections against discrimination for federal employees. Those signs that you saw, now in the Smithsonian, there they are next to Muhammad Ali's boxing gloves. But my favorite is this. This is Frank Kameny accepting in 2009 the highest award of the Office of Personnel Management, which is the successor, the renamed U.S. Civil Service Commission, and receiving and accepting a formal apology from the director of that agency, John Barry. Now, I want to go back to the name John Macy, Barry's predecessor, who had fired Kameny, refused to meet with Kameny. Probably not a bad guy, a bureaucrat doing what bureaucrats do. There's a particular detail of this day that's very meaningful to Frank Kameny and to me. And I'll let Frank tell you that.
The Civil Service Commission had its name changed. It's now the Office of Personnel Management, and directed by an openly gay man. Mr. Macy of the Civil Service Commission back then must be turning over in his grave. Oh, how I wish he were alive to see that. Oh, how I wish he were here.
Imagine that. That's a span of what, 50 years? One person's life. And then there's me. I'm no Frank Kameny. But in the early 90s, I came out in public as an openly gay writer and advocate. That was a time when people didn't do that. And then in 1994, following a controversial court decision in Hawaii, I realized that same-sex marriage would be my cause. I still remember going on a walk with my father in September 1995, who begged me not to become an advocate for same-sex marriage, not because he had anything against me or homosexuality, but because he said I would become a laughing stock in the world of journalism. I would not be taken seriously if I vouched for this crazy idea. And at the time, that seemed quite possible. I felt I had to write about it. It worked out well. But you can see this is an Economist cover I wrote in 1996, my book on gay marriage. That's the younger me taking every opportunity I can to make this case. And now, oops, you should have sound there. Nope. I was going to play you the clerk there. Oh yeah, that's what happens. See if we can get that going.
Under and by the virtue of the authority conferred upon me as branch chief of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, by the Congress of the United States of America, I now pronounce you legally married. Congratulations. You know what to do now.
How do we do that? Well, several things. First, we had massive grassroots support from straight America. Oh, wait, no, we didn't. We were a pariah class. We had no support at all. We were often criticized in those years for going to courts to vindicate marriage rights instead of going to the people. There was a problem. Not one state legislator in any state would even introduce a gay marriage bill. Okay, well, actually, the reason we succeeded was we were so well funded. We were gifted tens of millions of dollars by major foundations to launch this campaign. Oh, wait, no, we had no money at all. Frank Kameny operated on a shoestring and couldn't even get a job. No, it wasn't. Hate speech laws did it for us. We were, as a minority, we were protected from the haters, and we were able to use that. Wait, no, hate speech laws are unconstitutional in the United States. And if they had existed, they would have been used against us because we were the haters. We hated children. We hated America. We hated God. Oh, and we hated the American family. The truth is we had only one thing. Just one thing. It was our voices. That's all. That's what got us here. That's what Frank Kameny used. And as you can tell, he had a very loud voice. I knew Frank and watched his career. To my knowledge, never once in that long career did he ever seek to deplatform or silence anyone else, regardless of their viewpoint. He preferred to confront them. I heard him do that. I once heard him denounce a family values Christian at an event to his face, saying, if you believe that God hates people like me, then you worship a false and bigoted God. I was on a listserv with Frank. And whenever someone would post something stupid that some official or company had done and complain about it, his response was invariably the same. Don't tell me, tell them. Frank believed you go to the source, you use your voice. And so did many other gay rights activists. And that's why I can tell you, on behalf of all of us, Frederick Douglass was right. John Lewis was right. Isaiah Williams was right. There is nothing, I mean, literally nothing going on right now that breaks my heart more than to see minority rights activists, primarily on campus, but also off campus, places like the New York Times. People got an op-ed page editor fired for making them safe by running a conservative op-ed. What breaks my heart is that they now see freedom of speech as colonialist, bigoted, unsafe, and marginalizing. As I hope I've made clear, nothing could be further from the truth. And I would love it if those people would remember 4 things that are not frequently discussed on college campuses or elsewhere. Number 1, the hate speech helps us. Kameny understood that. He understood that the false and bigoted ideas and the hateful tone of our opponents may have been hurtful and harmful in the short run, but in the medium and long run, it was our best friend because it gave us the platform to compare our ideas about love and about truth and to present the real evidence. There is a problem with hate speech, but it is not the speech. It is the hate. Most people don't get up in the morning thinking, who can I hate on today? Some people do. Most people don't. Where hate comes from is fear and ignorance. And I guarantee you, if you folks believe that homosexuals were subverting our country, seducing your children, mentally ill, and bringing God's wrath down upon us, you would hate and fear homosexuals too. We fought that by showing that those things were not true. That is how you root out hate. Fighting hate by censoring or silencing hate speech is like fighting global warming by breaking all the thermometers. Second, words aren't violence. There's this notion today, using a word like faggot, or certain other words that I won't name, or saying things like homosexuality is a disease treatable with therapy. One of the very first speech code cases at University of Wisconsin considered a student who said that in a classroom. He was disciplined for it. By the way, he was a student of color. Those may be bad ideas. They may be poorly intended. But they do not have the same effect on us that being clubbed over the head does. When I am hit on the skull with a baseball bat, I don't have a lot of volition or agency about deciding how to interpret that. I may live, I may die, but that will be up to the doctors in the emergency room. When I am called an epithet like faggot, or when someone propounds a suggestion like homosexuality is a treatable disease, or that homosexuality is objectively disordered. Does anyone recognize that one, by the way? No? No one recognizes homosexuality as objectively disordered? That's the Catholic Catechism right now. I have a choice about how to interpret this. I can interpret them as deep and grievous wounds to my dignity from which I may never recover, or I can interpret them as the person saying them, saying, I, that is the person, am ignorant and need to be corrected in my views. I can make that choice. I can decide, as I urge people to do. When confronted with an idea that seems hateful or wrongheaded or bigoted or just dumb, I can decide to dial my reaction down to annoyance instead of up to outrage. Too few people are making that choice, but we do have that choice. Third, don't protect us. You remember the court decision, the district court decision that talked about a hardened and weakened population. Weakened, what does he mean? He means that we homosexuals are submitting to base urges that we're somehow too weak to resist. Think about this trope of weakness and minorities. Think about the justification that was given for slavery and Jim Crow. Black people were too childlike, too unintelligent, too mentally weak to look after themselves. They needed the guiding hand of the white man. Think about opponents of feminism. Why should women be second-class citizens who, for example, were effectively chattel in their own marriages, rights subsumed under the rights of their husband? Well, because women are the gentler sex. They don't have the strength to look after themselves. They don't understand things like throw weights. And think about the stigmatization of homosexuals and how much of that has to do with weakness. The notion that we can't resist the dark urges because we're too weak, so we need society's help to do it. Or the words that are used against us, limp wrists, sissy, fairy. These are words about patheticness and weakness, which we took on board and internalized for generations. And now, amazingly, I see activists whose first reaction if they hear something they don't like is to run to mommy in the person of the administration. And I feel embarrassed for them and for me, because we don't need that. Please don't protect us. I will not melt if you approach me with an idea that I don't like. You may be surprised to know, they have these bias incident reporting systems in campuses around the country, and they're pretty East German and pretty chilling. But there is a version of that I support, and it's Frank Kameny's version, which is if you're biased toward me, report it to me, and we'll have a conversation. I guarantee it will be a civil conversation, but you will leave knowing something about me that you didn't know before. And for God's sake, microaggressions. This is tuning us not to be outraged at the big stuff, but at the smallest stuff, the ordinary conversation. We would never have gotten gay marriage if we were worried about microaggressing or being microaggressive. And then fourth, the burden is also a gift. You heard the students in their manifesto talk about this. You heard this effectively said in the Silliman College potluck. Look, we're members of marginalized minorities. Our life is tough enough in many ways as it is. It's not fair to ask us to bear the burden of being spokespeople for rights or for our races, that we should have to go around explaining ourselves to you. No, get yourself educated. Google that shit. Well, there's something to this. There is a kind of burden, a kind of tax of having to explain yourself to a majority, having to justify yourself to a majority. I know that. In 20 years of advocacy for same-sex marriage, I can tell you that there is a demeaning aspect to going to straight people and saying, oh, please, Mr. Straight Person, won't you allow me to get married too? Can't I please do that? We felt marriage is an entitlement. They take it for granted. In fact, they abuse it. And yet they have the gall to say, we need to justify this thing from scratch and convince them. That's not fun, so I grant that. What's too often forgotten, though, is that the burden is also a gift. Being an advocate for same-sex marriage, win or lose, though it's better to win, has been the greatest privilege of my life. The marginalized, the dissident, they are always society's canary in the coal mine against injustice. The marginalized are always the first to see injustice, the first when they can to speak out about injustice. And they have the burden, yes, but also the privilege of being the moral instigators and the moral instructors. And that is a role we may not always choose, but it is a role that we should embrace. And I promise you, for those who are so lucky in life as to have the ability to take up a burdensome cause, you will not regret. You will feel privileged at the end of the day to have had the meaning that that cause gave you, to see it through, if you can, and to live in an environment where you can do that. So I ask my friends who are now campaigning against free speech as oppressive and burdensome and unsafe and all the rest, I ask them to consider all of those things and think twice. But it seems best if we give the last word to Frank. forgot my slogan. Minorities are always better off in a society that protects hate speech than in a society that protects us from hate speech. And I use the word always deliberately.
Here we are now. You heard the presidential proclamation, the very idea back then that the president would actually say something like that he would have a reception to celebrate Gay Pride Month, would have been unthinkable. So we have moved ahead over the last almost exactly half a century from the depths of ignominy to well, we have a way to go yet, but to awfully close. I mean, a meeting like this in a government building would be inconceivable. Absolutely inconceivable.
Thank you all for hearing me out.